Now, they are the price, they are the collateral damage of our culture. Sam, are you confident that individual consciousness, like my individual Russell Brand consciousness and your individual Sam Harris consciousness, are distinct, separate things that are not qualitatively similar, if not ultimately the same? I know there is zero scientific evidence to suggest that all consciousness is one, but given your research scientifically and personal spiritual investigations, is there anything that suggests to you that consciousness as a phenomena may be universal?
Well, it's universal in the sense that it is simply the fact of experience. It's the fact that there's something that is like to be you, and there's something that is like to be me. And so it's almost analogous to space. It's like the space in this room is seamless, right, and undivided. And you ask yourself, well, so what about the space? Like, what about the space inside this water bottle? Well, where is the water bottle with reference to space? Well, it's the only place it can be. It's right there where the water bottle is. If I move it, it moves. But there's no other place. If you're asking about the space, it has a kind of sameness regardless of what object in that space you're talking about. And consciousness has that property, at least conceptually. Now, we don't know how consciousness arises in the physics of things. We don't know if it's a product of
matter.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly good reason to believe that it is, but we don't know how far down it goes. It could be a fundamental constituent of matter, or it could arise on the basis of assemblies of neurons.
Is the good reason to believe that it comes from matter, that the more complex an organism is, the more evidence of functioning rational consciousness there is?
Well, it's a. I mean, you sort of start the universe from the Big Bang, right? And the idea that, we find complex arrangements of matter giving rise to different emergent properties, and life is one of those properties, and all of the features of life, reproduction and metabolism and the order we see in the natural world is the result of a process of increasing complexity, and at the end of some significant period, I mean, in our case, billions of years, you find organisms that exhibit the properties of consciousness, but the only consciousness we're sure of, 100% sure of, is the consciousness in our own case. Now, we can reason by analogy. We look at dogs and other complex animals, and we can say, well, to imagine that they don't have consciousness but only seem to have it, that's actually not parsimonious, because they're so similar to us neurologically and in every other way that to imagine that the lights come on somewhere between them and us seems irrational. But how far down that goes is anybody's guess, and intuitions really divide. So if you ask most neuroscientists or philosophers of mind, is there something that it's like to be a fly, right, that's got 100,000 neurons in its brain? People just, it's a kind of coin toss, right? Now, I think there's, again, so it could be, again, we simply don't know at what point consciousness emerges, but it's possible that single cells are conscious in some way, right? I mean, that's like you wouldn't expect the living world to appear differently if cells were conscious, right? But it would be genuinely mysterious, because when you look at the human brain, there seems to be a lot of neural activity, in fact, most neural activity, that is not associated with what you experience as consciousness, or I experience as consciousness from a first-person side. So,
most neural activity is not related to what we experience as consciousness, but it's most anatomical, biological stuff.
Yeah, most of what your brain is doing isn't showing up in your first-person experience as consciousness.
My individual identity is just like a cherry on the cake, while the kidneys and the blood.
Yeah, but
it's
the only thing that ultimately matters, right? I mean, it's a and it's the only thing that any of us can be absolutely sure of. And so this is my line about consciousness being the only thing in the universe that can't be an illusion. I'm not the first person to say this, obviously, but it's the only thing that has to be true of us no matter how mistaken we might be about everything else. So if we're in the Matrix right now, and this is just we're just living in the simulation on some alien supercomputer, and none of what we think is real is actually real, consciousness is still real. I mean, consciousness is just simply the fact that anything seems to be happening at all. Or if you're really asleep and dreaming right now, and we're not really doing this podcast, you're totally confused about your actual circumstance, but you're actually not confused about the fact that you're conscious.
Although it would explain why I've got no trousers and pants on.
Right. I was hoping you had trousers on.
Hey, but Sam, see how you just described consciousness then as a potentially sort of a construction, and it's only our personal consciousness that we can be certain is not an illusion. Many, about, sort of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. Many of these ideas are sort of using a vernacular that is naturally determined by the time in which it was conceived. It talks about these ideas, maya, illusion, that, and for me, because of like you also said, that list of values that would be useful, and which I've sort of said, they're part of the baby in the bathwater, aren't they?
Right.
Like, it seems to me that possibly within, if we can somehow extract what is positive from what is called religion, that it leads us to ideas such as fraternity, unity, oneness, compassion, and do you not find connections between what you have learned in neuroscience and what you have learned from studying sort of Buddhism?
Oh yeah. Well, the connections are very direct, but
how do they know that stuff?
But we don't want just because it's just the nature of consciousness. You're talking about people who have spent, especially in the Buddhist case, just an incredible amount of time studying from the first person side what experience is like, what its character is. And so, I mean, one analogy would be, the central claim of Buddhism is not just Buddhism, but Buddhism, and I would put several of the Indian traditions like Advaita Vedanta in there, with the central claim is that the self is an illusion. The ego is an illusion. And when I say self, I don't mean that people are illusions. I mean that the sense that you have a subject riding around in your head thinking your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
That there's a thinker in addition to the thoughts. That's an illusion.
Yes.
And that makes perfect sense neurologically, because there's no place in the brain for your ego to be sitting. There's no central place where everything comes together. There's no unchanging center in the brain. You're just talking about a cascade of neurophysiology, and everything is distributed everywhere. And it's not, and there are various parts of the brain that are coming online and off and subserving conscious states, and not. It's a process. And if you could experience consciousness as a flow of sensory and emotional and interoceptive experience without the sense that there's an unchanging center riding around on that flow, right? Like a man in a boat on the stream of consciousness.
Yes.
If you could experience that consciousness without that, that would be an experience that is much more coincident with what we understand neurologically. That would be to experience something that is more true from the third person, brain-based, what do we see inside the head side. And it just so happens you can experience that. That is what meditation is like when you really know how to meditate. This sense that there's a meditator in the head strategically paying attention to experience rather than just pure experience, that drops away, right? So that's one piece of data in favor of introspection here, and it's not a piece that the Western intellectual tradition or the Western spiritual tradition ever got a good handle on. I mean, so yes, you can find specific Christian and Jewish and Muslim mystics making these noises, but when they make these noises sufficiently, they start to sound like Buddhists, and their co-religionists want to kill them rather often, right?
Yes, and not only the co-religionists, the powerful entities within nation states and economic. Like, if people start believing they're not individuals, it's very hard to market at them.
But we haven't had a lot of problems with people being killed for not doing enough shopping in shopping malls because
unless there's a shooting in the shopping mall,
right.
or unless the stuff they buy in the shopping mall kills them.
But if you look at the history of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, you find people who, I mean, these are explicitly dualistic traditions. You have a soul. You have a soul that exists in relationship to the divine, and that division
I would say that the
is
reason
maintained theologically.
I would say, Sam Harris, that the reason that bifurcation occurred is precisely because were man's relationship with the divine prioritized in the manner that you've just been describing, that seems neurologically apposite, were that to become our priority, a materialistic, let's call it, lifestyle, a mechanistic social system such as the ones that we inhabit would be less fertile, because if people believed that the ultimate reality was not being experienced by the self, that there was no self, that unbinds us. That makes oneness a real possibility. That starts to suggest that your consciousness and my consciousness ultimately are the same, or at least there's nothing to suggest that they're any different, and that the things that we believe to be different are superficial accents acquired through culture and education.
But that's also true materially, and we shouldn't give the material short shrift, because the material progress is the thing that frees attention to, just you roll back the clock long enough, you find people living in just perpetual states of trying not to die, right? You're fending off wild animals, you're exposed to the elements, you're suffering the consequences of disease, and you have no concept of what disease is, right? You don't know about the germ theory of disease, and your child dies, and you think it's because your neighbor shined the evil eye on the child, right? So it's like you have magical beliefs accounting for changes in the world, and they're completely fallacious, right? So the progress we've made in understanding the material world is all to the good, except we have all of these misaligned incentive problems and externalized damages to very good things. Like you want an iPhone, right? But you don't want people jumping off the roof of Foxconn because life is so painful there to make an iPhone, right? So is it possible to make an iPhone without creating just unendurable misery for some number of people? Undoubtedly, it must be true, right? We haven't figured it out yet, so as to make that the default, and we need to do that. But there is no distance between the material and the spiritual here. Because if consciousness is just a matter of information processing in the right complex systems, and if consciousness could one day be born in our computers, right? Well, then we'll have an ethical obligation to not make our computers suffer, right? If Siri could suffer, right? Well, then it matters how you talk to her, and it would matter every.
I've only used her for stupid questions. Mine's a bloke, actually.
Oh yeah.
Why complicate life?
And we're obviously not there yet, or it certainly seems obvious that we're not there yet. But at a certain point, we will very likely either be in the presence of conscious machines or think we are, right? We'll lose sight of they'll emulate conscious systems in a compelling enough way that our default will be, I'm in relationship to this thing now, and to withdraw a sense of consciousness in that case would seem just unprincipled and unethical. We could well build machines that seem to have emotional lives and even have more richer emotional lives than we do, because they're going to have access to all of human knowledge, all of the aesthetic products of human ingenuity for all of history, and they'll be able to talk about them and appreciate them and remind you of how much you love certain things and react to your emotion faster and more accurately than your best friends or your spouse, right? Ultimately, we will very likely build these machines, and if we haven't understood how consciousness arises in physical systems, we'll think they're conscious, and we will maybe right or wrong about that. And whether we're right or wrong about that will be of huge consequence, because it would be it would be an absolutely abhorrent act to build conscious systems that can suffer in ways we don't even understand.
Yes.
And just to cavalierly, spawn this off in simulations and, on the Amazon cloud and not know what the hell we're doing.
For me, though, of course, we've already created, that this is not just a hypothesis, because already all around us, as we've already fleetingly discussed, lie scattered the damaged and broken and presumably conscious entities that are our fellow human beings, our fellow Englishmen and Americans scattered and broken around us. Sam, so for me, here's 2 points to wrap up, because we've gone much longer than I intended to.
Sure.
It was trippy, huh?
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of questions still. Let me see if I can.
I'm fine on time, so you can just.
I'll see if I can do it as one tumble dryer, one whirling neurological sprawl, one linguistic regurgitation in your general direction. Here are the things that interest me. One, on a podcast I was listening to you do once, and it's an idea that's sort of more commonly understood, that possibly free will is an illusion, that decisions are made prior, so morality and ethics sort of suffer somewhat if that's true. Two,
I don't think that final part holds.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay,
I think you can have all the morality. You can have all the morality.
Person.
Helplessly,
I've realised
yes.
about you.
Yeah. You can have your morality and ethics without free will.
Can have morality and ethics without free will, but their role, but the way we evaluate them has to be sort of looked at differently. Do it in one big. Let me do my vomit.
Yeah, go for it.
Then you do yours back.
Go for it. Yeah.
Yours is more piecemeal. Yeah. Mine's a sort of a literal slew. Yours has all sorts of rationalism and academia, like built on a sort of a Minecraft. So it's a beautiful architecture. So Sam Harris. The other thing is, when you have taken psychedelics, did you not experience things that are comparable to what you described is neurologically demonstrable and what you've experienced in meditation? I sense that your individual identity is a sort of a confection of sort of ideas and sensation, and that there is a sort of a beautiful oneness. I myself have taken hallucinogenic. I'm clean now for 15 years, but prior to that, when I used to take hallucinogens, the thing I didn't have the vocabulary, artillery or education to understand what the hell was going on, and I wish I'd been born into some sort of shamanic tradition where people taught you what spirit is, where they taught you what it is to be a man, what they taught you what love is, and how to behave, and how to create systems, and how to father a daughter, and how to take care of it. Regardless, I experienced something within my identity, seemingly beyond my identity as a 16-year-old boy. I remember thinking, oh my God, this is not who I am. I am not this body. My consciousness is other than this temporarily individuated form. Only the distinction, and even just on the physics level, like everything was one, everything is expanding. I am only experiencing time in an animalistic way because of my own entropy and atrophy. Were I a limitless and eternal material being, I would see myself as part of the whole, as part of oneness, because the way that I narrativize my life is as a result of biocentric experience as opposed to objective experience. I've just been subjected to this stimuli and I've built an identity around it. It felt extremely true, and it stayed with me ever since, and I've revisited it through meditation. Aside from it being an interesting experience intellectually, is an interesting experience emotionally and spiritually. And if this sense of oneness does not translate into a sort of a personal ethical code, that means I treat people lovingly, what is its value? So there's two questions. Have you experienced that state, and what do you think of it, the moral and ethical implications on an individual, and how does it translate into our behavior?
Well, there are two states I would want to differentiate. There are two ways in which you can think about the loss of self and the sense of oneness. So with psychedelics, you get, to come back to what I said before, you have consciousness and its contents, right? There's the fact that things are appearing. There's the fact that there is experience. And consciousness is the knowing aspect of experience. And in the normal course of events, you have, ordinary sights and sounds and smells and sensations and thoughts and emotions. And and most people go through life thinking every moment of the day in that context. They don't know how to meditate. They don't have any mindfulness. They have this sort of white noise of discursivity where they're talking to themselves, and everything they see and sense and every interaction is filtered through this conversation they're having with themselves, and the world they see visually and the world they sense with with touch and other senses is tiled over with concepts. So I look at a bottle and I see bottle, right? I'm not this field of light and shadow and color is differentiated by concepts. I see my phone, I see a bottle, I see the table, and everything is solidified that way. Now, what happens with psychedelics is your habit pattern of thought and attention is completely bowled over by the pharmacology of whatever you've just ingested. Right? So if it's acid or mushrooms or any of those classic psychedelics, it's just whoever you are, whatever your talents are at introspection, whether you've ever wanted to meditate or not, you are guaranteed to have a change in your experience if you take a sufficient dose of a psychedelic. Now, it can be a very chaotic and unpleasant change. It can mimic psychosis. Right? A bad acid trip is really bad and not spiritually uplifting at all. But a good one can put you in a state which is just unimaginably expansive, where like all of this, the normal kind of perceptual categories and emotional barriers between you and the world break down, and there can be this kind of like just this free flowing exchange of energy and sense of oneness, where you can you touch a tree with your hand, and there can be kind of a laser like concentration in the sensation of just having your hand make contact with the tree, and there can be just this sense of just the energy of that touch, right, can become, it's like you're turning up the volume on this channel of information and making it conscious in a way that it never is in normal life. And so you could spend 2 hours just in this kind of orgasmic union with a tree, right, on the right drug. Now, you can have all of those changes happen in your consciousness, like the full pyrotechnics of a psychedelic display without losing the sense of an ego. You can actually you can still feel that you are the center of that, and it's just so much better, or in the chaotic psychotic side, so much worse to be you at that moment. Now, for me, meditation has a very if you go in intensive retreat and you're spending 12 to 18 hours a day meditating, you can have psychedelic-like changes in the contents of consciousness. But the more important change for me is the insight that there is no center to consciousness, that there simply is consciousness and everything appearing. And when you have that insight, it actually doesn't matter what is appearing. It doesn't matter if when you touch the tree, it feels like a million watts of sublime energy, and there's no barrier between you and the tree. That is the same on some fundamental level. That's the same as just seeing a water bottle and picking it up and having a drink in a completely otherwise ordinary state of consciousness. The center can drop out equally or be present equally in both of those cases. And I'm much more interested in finding this unifying experience of centerlessness in the midst of whatever is happening. Because the problem with the psychedelic experience or any peak experience is that they come and go. They're by nature impermanent, right? And you had to bring some causes and conditions together to make them happen, whether they're pharmacological or meditational. You had to go on retreat for a year and meditate 18 hours a day in order to see those inner lights or whatever it was, or you had to kind of blow your mind on acid and be kind of useless for the rest of the day in order to have that. It's possible to have no ego and have none of the problems which an ego gives you in a state of otherwise totally ordinary consciousness, in a state that's compatible with having this conversation. It's just you either feel like there's someone behind your face in this moment or not. I mean, that's really what it is. It's like if you're looking at me and I'm looking at you, the default state of consciousness is to feel like you're behind your face looking out at a world that's not self. It's like you're over there, you're kind of behind the mask that is your face, and you're looking at me. And that's and when I look at you, when I react to something you say, right? When I say, well, that's clearly bullshit. Well, hey, you haven't thought that through. That feeling of, my pointing at like this, you're implicated over there, right? And you begin to react based on that implication. It's possible to lose that and to have like just the world remains, and yet nothing else changes. There's no strange lights. There's no kundalini in the body. There's nothing. Nothing has to get weird or psychedelic, and it doesn't matter if it does get weird and psychedelic from that place.
No, you're right, that there is a sort of, if there is no pragmatism to spirituality, if there is no practical application to these extreme experiences within consciousness, then what is their value? My feeling is that the sort of the linguistics and grammar of mechanics, the apparent separateness, the meaning of gesture, the very notion of you and I. There are moments where I experience it as temporal. There are moments where, to use the great Bill Hicks's, I think, perfect phrase, I feel that we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. When you talk about the loss of the being behind the mask of the face, for me, we are talking about enlightenment, and you're talking about a rather ascetic version of that without bells and whistles and pyrotechnics, to use your earlier phrase. But similarly, when you talk about the psychedelic, that sort of very emotional description of connection and love. For me, these are the kind of experiences that we need to convey into an environment that, deprived of that kind of experience and understanding, creates maximum security prisons which find further means for degradation in gangs and separation once within it. That we are living perhaps in a time that is, for me, determined by the extraction of the spiritual as opposed to the sort of the amplification of it. And for me, the distinction that you and I have in the way that we view the world is that I feel that the main agent in extracting this element of spirit, without which I don't see a solution for the 7 billion people on this planet, that the main agent is post-secular capitalist culture. And you believe
I
that
don't
it's
agree.
religion.
Well, no, it's not only religion, but it's dogmatism. It's bad ideas that are immune from criticism and therefore remain effective. So what we need, well, again, it comes back to conversation and violence. We need successful conversations. We need to converge. We need to find the thing that can be said so as to get the people who are wrong to recognize it, right? And that's all of us some of the time, right? It's like how long do you want to be wrong for?
Yes.
How long do you want to be living under the sway of a powerful bad idea?
Yes.
Now, there are people who have powerful bad ideas that they class as religious, who are determined to live the rest of their lives under the sway of those ideas, no matter how much evidence piles up against them. And no matter what the consequences. And so that's why religion, for me, has a special character. But political dogmatism is, in many cases, just as problematic. Economic dogmatism, in certain cases, could be the greatest engine of harm we ever see, right? So it's just, but it's again, it matters what is true. It matters what causes systems to work and to reliably fail.
It does, Sam. And given that, I think in the last few minutes of our conversation, we've got close to something that seems like a fundamental truth that we can agree on, that there seems to be some essence behind temporal individuality that has some kind of seeming universality, though how could anybody ever possibly really say? That it is, if we can bring our focus as individuals and as a society to that notion, a notion which does exist in all religions, I would say, in a relegated role, and as you said earlier, in a role that, when mysticism.
Let me just ask you, what's the reason to say that it exists in all religions? Because what if it doesn't? Like what then? Or what if it doesn't equally? Or what if much of the religion repudiates this core truth?
Well, I would say that you and I are having the same conversation and agree about something fundamental, and to elect to disagree for the purposes of hypotheses would be a silly thing to do, because within Christianity, as you've already said, there's a mystical tradition. Within Islam, there is. Within Buddhism, it's sort of more practically delineated. It's in Jainism. I don't know all religions. I don't know enough about it. But what I'm saying is that what excites me is when I see perennial mythic templates recurring through folklore, faith, monotheism, pantheism, that all seem to infer the truth that you are personally describing, that you have psychedelically described, that you have neurologically described. For me, that's important, Sam.
But it's very important to realize that they don't all do it equally, and to pay lip service to the idea that they're all teaching the same thing equally well is creating, I would argue, an immense amount of harm.
But but there are some dogmas and doctrines that say it doesn't exist and that it's irrelevant and that it's not there at all.
Also a huge problem.
I don't think, say, take our two countries. I don't think the dominant ideologies are drawn from religion. They're drawn from post-Enlightenment, rational, materialistic ideas, and from economic ideas and colonial ideas and post-Westphalian treaty ideas of state and nation and power. People aren't going, like, the big problems aren't derived from a sort of a religious source, and if they are the very components that share those qualities with non-religious power structures. The important thing, and the thing that is not present almost by definition in a secular culture, is this idea of essence and truth, other than through mechanistic exploration through science, which, whilst, as you have already brilliantly explained, is invaluable. It can't, like, I know you've done talks that directly contradict this, but we can't answer the questions of the experience of essence yet, and perhaps one day we will. But so it seems to me that at some point faith will be required. Let me give you one example that I think ties together a lot of what we disagree about here, and it crystallizes the point I'm urging you to take seriously. And this Do you think that I don't take it seriously?
Yeah, I mean, this is
Do you think I don't take it seriously?
No, this particular point. Let me just crystallize this point. And it's the problem of dogmatism. Why dogmatism is basically always bad and unforeseeably bad. You can't in advance know how bad a dogma is going to be just by considering the sentence on paper. But the dogmatism is just the wrong methodology for getting anywhere worth going, because it is the antithesis of open conversation.
Yeah.
And this is the example that I now always use because it just is so clear. The dogma that all human life is equally sacred, all human lives are equally valuable, and that life starts at the first moment, the moment of conception, right? Now, this on its face, if you just told me, if 20 years ago you said, what if someone who believes this, what sort of needless human misery is he going to manufacture? I would say, well, this is the most benign thing you could possibly believe. Who's going to get killed in the service of this dogma, right? Who's going to be tortured for decades in the service of this dogma? But when you look at what people have traditionally done with this specific idea, and this is a Judeo-Christian idea,
and it's in the American Constitution, so it's a nationalistic idea also.
But especially the link to the moment of conception. You look at the millions of Americans who opposed embryonic stem cell research, right? With all the promise that held, right? Here we have Petri dishes filled with, it's imagined, hundreds of human souls that are microscopic. And to kill those souls would be tantamount to murder. To experiment on those souls would be tantamount to murder. And therefore, they didn't want to have a conversation about all of the children and adults with life-deranging injuries and diseases who might have been helped, had progress been made in that area. Now, that is a psychotic moral attitude made possible by the most benign-seeming dogma, right? I mean, literally, we're talking about people who,
No, but that's just one aspect of it. There's an understandable squeamishness about human life, and we've all seen, like, the little baby pro-life type images and stuff. But also, Sam, there's an ongoing dialectic between the scientific community and religious community of who's got the right to be the the parental figure in ownership of the public sphere and the public soul, in inverted commas. So, like, there's a lot of kickback, atavistic kickback from Christian groups over these sort of, like, evidently beneficial scientific endeavors.
But it's a sincerely held belief. I believe
Sure
the
thing.
soul enters the zygote at the moment of conception, and then therefore I'm worried.
And it's a sort of an interesting sort of notion, and I think you and I would be on the same side of that particular argument, clearly. But what I would say is that we need to again revert to focusing on what is truly divine or sublime, these moments of interconnectivity and oneness, and then we wouldn't need trash talismans to be placeholders for meaning in a culture that has lost its meaning, I would say in significant part because the role of the spiritual has been relegated to meaninglessness in favour of a materialistic, mechanistic culture that leads ultimately to sort of widespread consumerism and sort of unconsciousness, that we're continually in that world of reiterative thought, constant tangled thought, that because people have no experience of the sublime, of the divine.
But again, I just wouldn't. So you have your own fetishistic objects, like this notion of consumerism, right? So like you and I are having this conversation in a podcast studio at Headspace. Right, Headspace is a meditation app that on the one hand is the quintessence of consumerism. I mean, this is something that's only happens in a smartphone, right? The very phone that I was talking about that's causing people to jump off rooftops, right? So, and yet I think Headspace is an absolutely good thing to have out there, and it's bringing a incredibly useful practice to millions of people. And podcasts bring incredibly useful conversations to millions of people. All of this is enabled by mere materialism and mere consumerism. And there has to be an ethical and spiritually correct way to do all this. It's not a matter of getting rid of the microphones and getting rid of the smartphones.
Of course, and I'm not suggesting that. I'm just the same way as you would posit there is an extremist and dangerous version of Islam, which I would say has that I don't think is an essentially malevolent idea. I would disagree with that strongly. I would say that people having objects isn't necessarily wrong, but to fetishize objects and to believe that some kind of fulfillment and spiritual solution can be achieved through the acquisition of objects is dangerous, and all the more dangerous because it's not so explicitly understood that that's what's happening. That the extremist ideology that we already live within is so all-encompassing that we cannot see its horizons, that we have lost the tools to understand it and describe it. I'm not talking about sort of a post-Stalinist leftist position. I'm talking about the reinvention and the re-embracing of the human soul. Can we find that? You've talked, Sam, endlessly about we need to have a conversation. Well, you and I are having a conversation. I believe in God. You don't believe in God. And it turns out that the differences aren't actually, when it boils down to it, that meaningful, because when it comes to love of our daughters, freedom, compassion, we ultimately believe the same things. I think that unless you and I can find a way of saying, okay, I respect that, like a lot of the people whose guidance I seek most earnestly are atheists, but that doesn't change the fact that I believe that there are levels of consciousness that are beyond material phenomena that we'll never understand through magnifications of the human senses or further analysis of the material objects, because there are limitations to the human mind. And ultimately, and importantly, Sam, I also think that all of this stuff, all of this ethereal wittering has no meaning unless it translates into love and compassion, unless there is some meaning in the idea that there is some connection between a tree and a hand if you achieve the correct mental state.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are wrinkles here that I just want to flag. One is that extreme mental pleasure is divorceable from ethics. So, for instance, to go back to this perverse case that we started with, suicide bombing, I have good reason to believe that the mental state of a suicide bomber before he...
You think it's euphoric?
Yes. We're not talking about suicidal people who are just trying to end the depression as fast as possible. We're talking about people who are on the cusp of the
Yes,
deepest
yes,
spiritual
I know,
reward.
But all right, but then let's take this. Listen, you like thought experiments, and you've had so much time with suicide bombers. Take a person like a policeman that's willing to risk his own life to rescue a child in jeopardy.
Yeah.
Similarly, their regard for their own life is being abandoned in that moment, and that too could be described as a kind of euphoria.
Oh, sure.
But because it happens to fit in with our worldview, we're cool with it.
Yeah, but so that's what I'm saying. The real consequences for human beings matter. And it's possible to, euphoria is something, and a sense of meaning is something that can be totally misaligned with what I think we would agree is an actual ethical relationship and an actual spiritual insight. And so euphoria is not a perfect guide. It can be a very misleading guide for wisdom and compassion. That's the point I was making.
This is true. I've made some bloody bad decisions as a result of euphoria.
Yeah, and so and the absence of euphoria can also be misleading because they're genuine. Like so, what I just said about this kind of non-dual experience in meditation, you can have it in a very subtle way that doesn't summon, at least certainly doesn't immediately summon some radical change in the feeling tone of your experience. It can be as simple as just looking at a water bottle, and it's just that it's just the lights are on and there's no center. Now you can feel that for just a moment and not recognize its revolutionary significance because it doesn't come with the upwelling of rapture or bliss that people associate with good meditation or a psychedelic experience or ordinary religiosity like feelings of love while chanting or singing in church or whatever it is.
Or at a football match or wherever. There are various contexts in which these states can be achieved. And I suppose what I believe is that we should be looking to create these states, prioritize these states, and give more people access to them through whatever means. Certainly I don't agree with the imposition of an ideology of dogma on anybody else, and I think the key obstacles to that are huge centralized power bases, and without the removal of that, I don't see how there could be a solution.